So it's good to see your faces again. You probably remember me from a couple of weeks ago, but my name is Patricia Simpson. I'm with the School of Chemical Sciences Career Services Office. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about resumes, cover letters, just in general, things that you want to make sure you have on those documents. And then we're also going to talk about the job search process. And it really isn't specific to chemistry, chemie, biosciences, anything like that. But I would say it is more specific to undergraduate students. So that's good for all of you. And students in the science or engineering fields, just some of the things that we're going to talk about specifically today. So before I start, how many of you have a resume put together? Awesome. That's what I would expect. How many of you have had that resume looked at by like a career services person here on campus? Okay. That's pretty common. So that's great, because then hopefully we'll have something new for each of you to learn today. Before I jump into that, I do want to talk a little bit more specifically about my office and the things that we can offer. So if you are a chemistry or chemical engineering student, just some of the specific things about us. Now, a handshake in Illinois is for everybody. So again, I think I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago, but if you have a net ID, you have a handshake account. So we really encourage you to get in there, don't wait until you're a senior and you're looking for a full-time job, but even career events that might be relevant for you, or graduate schools that are planning to come to campus. Basically, everything is going to be posted in that system. My office also helps, as do pretty much every career office on campus, with resumes, CVs, cover letter critiques, giving you feedback, either via electronic means or sitting down and talking one-on-one. We also have a mock interview program, which several offices on campus do, although not every career office. But that's a good opportunity for you to actually practice those interview skills before it counts. So when you think about going on an interview, not to freak you out, but it's kind of like getting an A or an F for the entire semester on one grade, one exam, one test. And that's really what happens with a resume or with an interview. You're either going to get to the next step with a company or you're not. And it's all based on that one experience. So you really want to, just like you would study for a test that was worth that much, you really want to study, practice, etc. for an interview before you go in. So using things like mock interview programs are really great to do that. We can also, through most offices, talk with you like, hey, this is what I'm thinking about majoring in, but I don't know what I want to do. I don't know how to go about doing that. Come see somebody. Like, don't wait until, again, you're later in your career. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, our career office is kind of like having that GPS system. You can still make detours, you can still go somewhere else, but it helps get you on that right path early on, hopefully, rather than jumping in the car and going. Some other basic things, there are a ton of career fairs on campus. There are a ton of other big events like that. So if you're thinking graduate school, for example, there's a huge graduate and professional school fair every fall that I would encourage you to go to early on so that you can kind of start seeing what options are out there. And then career advising if you're thinking about switching a major or doing something like that and you're not quite sure what path to take. All right, so how do you start putting together that resume? That's sort of your first initial key. You want to think about what things you have that make you special and unique that maybe somebody else next to you doesn't. So what are your strengths? You need to know what your weaknesses are, not because you want to put them on your resume, but because you want to be able to compensate for those. You also want to think about at the same time what employers are seeking. So here's what I have, here's what employers are looking for, how do we put it together and put it on the resume? I think what a lot of people do is they just dump everything they've ever done on the resume, and that's not always the best way to go about that. Now, there may be positions that seem unrelated. So my very first job I ever had, I worked at Pizza Hut. Probably not relevant to my job today because I don't take orders from people, I don't serve food. Well, I mean, we do information sessions and I have pizza at those, but as a rule, on a general basis, that's not what I do. But other skills that I learned working at Pizza Hut would be relevant. So if for some reason I wanted to still include Pizza Hut on my resume today, I wouldn't even mention that I took orders or entered them into the computer. Rather, I'd focus only on those skills. I mean, they know my title was server, but focus only on those skills that would be relevant. So the problem solving and the customer service. So even if you haven't had directly related experiences yet, you can use the experiences you've have had and make them relevant. The main way to do that is identify those skills, those transferable experiences like I just mentioned. And then you also really always want to be going back to what is your focus, what is your purpose. And that kind of, I think, keeps you from just throwing everything on there and really makes it more of an intentional document. All right, so categories. Obviously, you have to have your header, which would be your name, your email address, your phone number, those types of things. That's kind of a given. I would say with that, though, make sure that your email address is either your @Illinois.net or something that sounds professional. Dorkboy@gmail.com probably isn't going to create the positive impression on an employer that you want it to. So that would be your heading. You also want to make sure, if you choose to include one, that an objective or a summary is very specific. Now, these are not required fields, and you only want to choose one or the other if you do include one. And it needs to be specific and stated towards what the employer is looking for. So you wouldn't put in an objective, I'm looking for a job where I can learn new things. Employers don't care about that. I mean, they do, but they really don't. They're looking for what you can contribute. So I think that's really important when you're putting together your document, and especially that objective or that summary statement, is focus on what you can do for them. How can you help them? What skills do you have that you can bring to that employer or to that graduate school or to that student organization, even if you have to submit a resume for that. If you choose to include a summary instead of an objective, it's the same thing. Focus on those things, not just everything that you have, but what specifically they might be looking for. Of course, your education would be a big section. You need to have some type of experience on there as well, whether it's related or you make it related. And then other categories kind of depend. So if you've been involved in activities, student organizations, or if you've had some leadership positions, leadership is definitely something that employers in particular are going to be looking for. So you want to make sure that that's on your resume. And experience can go in a lot of different ways. So for some students that's paid, some students that's unpaid, like a research experience. For most of you, I would also encourage you to put a skills section on your resume, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But that should really be your hard skills as opposed to soft skills. And then other stuff. Kind of depends on what you have to sell. So that's going to vary for each and every one of you. So some basic things that you don't want to do first. Obviously, these templates over here are kind of cheesy looking, so you don't want your resume to look cheesy. It needs to be a professional document. So make sure that you don't include photographs. Some countries, that is the way to go. Like, you have to include a photograph on your CV when you're applying. So if you're applying for global positions, make sure you know that you're applying the way that country wants you to apply. For the United States, no photographs. Make sure you also don't include personal pronouns. So back to your 5th grade or whatever we learned about those, I, me, their, your, none of those should be on your resume. Instead, you write more in an implied tense. So instead of saying I did this or I created this, you would just say created. So you kind of leave off those personal pronouns. Cute, I talked about the email. Another cute thing that I saw actually a couple of years ago, one of my chemistry students in her bullets was using beakers for her bullets. And it was cute, but it wasn't really professional for a resume. So you want to make sure that everything that you have on your resume, yes, kind of boring. Professional might mean kind of boring for our field, but that's okay. They're really focusing on the content of what your resume says rather than having it look cute or graphically pretty. So per presentation, personal information, of course, I mentioned the stuff you need to have at the top, but other types of personal information that you might not need to include for the U.S. that you might need to elsewhere would be like marital status or your social security number or your health. Some of those things are asked for in different countries, but you never want to include those on a resume in the United States. I would probably take it a step further, though, depending on other types of activities that you've been involved in. You still may want to be a little bit careful. So, for example, if there's a religious or a political group that you've been a part of, if you've just sort of joined and kind of gone to a couple meetings here or there, that may not be something that you include on your resume. Absolutely, discrimination is illegal in the United States, but unfortunately we know that it does still happen. So if it's something that you've just sort of gone to here and there, it may not be worth it to include that on your resume. On the other hand, if you've had a leadership position with that group or you've really done something that demonstrates some great experiences, my other thought, and I just kind of have to throw that out there, but my personal thought is I wouldn't really want to work for an organization that's going to discriminate against me because of those things anyway. And if I have good experiences from them, I'm going to still include them on my resume. So your call, but as a professional, I just need to make sure that you do so intentionally and make that decision. Abbreviations as in BS, totally fine. Most people know that that stands for Bachelor of Science. But maybe if you're involved in a student organization that has an abbreviation with it, or in some cases even techniques or instruments that you've used in the lab, if they're not really, really commonly known, I would encourage you to write those out rather than just to abbreviate. And then the final thing I would say is make sure your resume doesn't look like everybody else's. It's fine to follow a template to kind of get you started, but make it your own. So it shouldn't just look exactly like every other one that you've seen. So, all right, so laziness too. So you want to write and really describe to employers or to, again, the school or the organization, the things that you've done. Don't just imply that, which that sometimes means having to be a little bit longer on a bullet to really describe and make it clear what you're doing. All right, so things that you do want to make sure you're doing. You want to make sure that you're keeping it brief. So as an undergraduate student, for a job, internship, probably even a research position, that means 1 page. One exception would be is if you're doing a CV for like a PhD program, you could potentially make it a little bit longer depending on what you've done. We have several students who've done multiple research experiences and even as undergraduates maybe have published. So it's hard to get all of that onto 1 page. Any other time though, make sure you keep it to 1 page. They're just not going to read beyond that, and you want them to focus on the content. Make sure, because of that, that everything is also relevant. So I mentioned how you can kind of change positions or focus on different things with your bullets. But if there's something that you look at and you think, gosh, nobody's going to care about this. It was important to me, and so I was involved in it. That's great. But it might not be something that you include on your resume. I would also encourage you to proofread multiple times and maybe even have somebody else look at it. I have found so many times that relying on the spell check in Word doesn't catch everything. And even you being really careful about reading it may not catch it because you know what it's supposed to say, and it may not say that. So have an outside set of eyes, look it over, give you some feedback on that. The main reason for proofreading is because this should be your 100% best work. So if you have errors on your 100% best work, what's going to happen when you go into a research lab on a Monday morning and you need to do the same thing over and over and over again? If your 100% best has errors, that repetitive experiment that you have to do in the lab probably is going to have errors as well. So in theory, you've taken time to put together a really quality resume. So in theory, there should be no errors. So that's why proofreading is really important. And I have actually served on committees before, especially when there's a lot of applicants. We'll throw something out even for one error. We had an academic advising position open a few years back, and the candidate looks fantastic, but there were several errors on her resume. We thought, gosh, if she's got errors on her resume, what's she going to be like when she's looking at your class schedule? Is she still going to make errors? I don't think any student would want that. So because of those errors, even though everything else was great, we disqualified her from that position. So it is important that you proofread and you have somebody else look over that as well. Would also encourage you, as I mentioned on the previous slide, to keep it professional and make sure everything is boring if you need to, but focused on a nice, easy-to-read font and formatting. Consistency is also important. I think the main reason for consistency is if you are, again, going into that lab and you're going to be doing that repetitive task over and over and over, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've got good attention to detail skills. One way to do that is by making everything sort of look the same on your resume. Plus, the nice thing for the person reading your resume is because they'll probably only give you about 10 to 15 seconds on an initial run through of your resume, it makes it easier for them to find content instead of trying to like switch around and look for different information if it's in different orders. So if you've got something bolded, maybe you've got job titles bolded, then your degree title should also be bolded. If your degree title is on the second line and the name of the university is on the first line in your education section, then that experience section should look exactly like that. Job titles, degree titles, the same. Name of the school, name of the employer, the same. Be consistent throughout your whole resume. A few other tips. Order is important. I would say because we read top to bottom and left to right, left to right for you guys, make sure that you're putting the most important pieces of information in that area. For most recent graduates, education is going to be one of your most important things. So have that at the top and highlight that. Action verbs instead of big paragraphs, again, 10 to 15 seconds. So you really want to make sure that it's something that they can read quickly and sort of speed through. Even though you've got a professor in the room, if you think about a textbook and you've got two separate pages with basically the same information, but one is all in big paragraph form and one is more in a list format, which one are you more carefully looking at? You're going to look at the list format more carefully because obviously if something's in bullets, it probably is important in your textbooks. So same thing happens with your resume. Putting things in list format with shorter phrases is going to make them pay more attention. All right, so some other things as far as your education section. Students all the time will ask me, how do I list out my degree? What do I do about my major? You really want to make sure that you know what that is. So, for example, with chemistry, we've got 2 totally different degrees. You can either get a BS degree or you can get a BSLAS degree, so all those letters together. And a lot of students aren't sure about that. So if you've got questions or you're not sure, make sure you ask somebody, what is the degree that I'm getting, or you can look it up on your DARS report as well. So you'd list your degree and your major, of course. You would also list your anticipated graduation date. So even if you're a first-year student, you can still put on there, 2017 to present, but they want to know sort of when you're anticipating graduating. So either have a bullet, something along those lines. Now, if you are close to graduating, so I would say if you're graduating in May or maybe even by the end of 19, you could just say expected May 2019 instead of having your starting dates and your to present dates. So make sure that graduation date is on there. If you have a GPA that is a 3.0 or above, it should be on your resume. So you will probably, if you go to a career fair and you don't have your GPA on there, get asked that question, what is your GPA? So you always want to make sure if you don't have your GPA listed on your resume that you've got a story sort of prepared, and certainly you can come see me or another career services person. We're happy to walk through that with you. But if it's a 3.0 or above, it absolutely needs to be on your resume because a 3.0 GPA at the University of Illinois in any of the majors that you're in is still considered pretty strong. So make sure that that's on there. Related coursework, kind of up to you, kind of depends on what all you have on your resume. If you've done a lot of really amazing experiences and you've had some really good skills that you can put on there, related coursework may not be that relevant. But if maybe you're a first-year student and you're just starting out and you don't have a lot of stuff to put on there, you might want that section. If you do include relevant coursework, it needs to be the name of the course. So Chem 199 doesn't really mean anything to anybody outside of School of Chemical Sciences. So, and even then, because there's so many different Chem 199 courses. So write out the name of the course as opposed to including the numbers. Study abroad, if you do or have done that, absolutely should be on your resume. Make sure you list it the same way you've got University of Illinois. So you list the name of the school where you attended and the dates and so forth. If you didn't actually work on specific courses, you maybe just took general studies courses, that's fine. Instead of doing that degree, you would just say general studies courses. But at least that way they can see that you've had that experience. If you are first or probably through like the first semester of your second year, you can still have things from high school. But once you hit that second semester sophomore, first semester junior, everything from high school except for work experience should be removed from your resume. Which means for many of you that you have to get more involved here in college so you can fill up that space. Because I know a lot of our students were super involved in high school and then really don't do as much here. But that's sort of that general rule. Second semester sophomore, first semester junior is when you want to drop high school things. All right, so your experience section, rather than just saying I did, you want to make it exciting to the reader. So you want to use those action verbs. You want to also focus on the accomplishment of what you did as well as the result. So if you can include numbers on your resume in any way, that's always a good thing. It makes me understand a little bit more what you're doing, especially if it's something I don't understand. One of my students was just talking to me this morning about how she had had her resume reviewed by someone from a totally different department. And they looked at her resume and they said, well, this is all boring. I don't understand any of these skills and things that you're doing. It's not boring for us in this field. It's just boring for somebody in another area. But adding things like numbers, everybody can understand numbers. So sometimes that's a way to do that. Now, you do absolutely want to write to your audience. So if you're trying to focus on the instruments that you've worked on in a lab, the job that you're applying for is going to know what those are, and so they're going to care. So you still want to, again, always keep that audience in mind. Make sure your experience section is consistent, as I've mentioned earlier. Usually the information that you want to include is the employer, your job title, even if you have to make one up, the city and the state, and then the dates that you worked, as well as a few bullets to describe what you did. Bullets should really be, I would say, more about accomplishments than just the what you did. And again, those bullets should be more relevant to the position for which you're applying, even if the position itself wasn't. So if you were, let's say you were a building service worker, and so you basically went around and cleaned up offices and sort of dumped out the trash, I'm probably not going to care unless that's the exact same type of position that you're applying for again. However, many other jobs would care that you were able to precisely follow a routine, that you were able to accomplish a big, long task list within the allotted time, meeting deadlines. They might care if you worked as part of a team and you divvied up duties. So the position job description is less important than things that you picked out, like skills that can be transferred to another role. Make sense? All right. And again, not limited to paid employment by any means. So don't feel like you have to have an experience category and then like a research or, put them all together. That's totally fine. Unless you're trying to emphasize that, hey, I did have research and now I'm applying for a research position, so pay attention. Your skills section, a great thing to include would be lab skills, and I would be very specific. Don't just say, I've got basic lab skills, because that means nothing. But what skills? It doesn't have to be from a research position. It can be from your classes. So go back to your first chem class. Did you learn about titrations? I mean, even that can be included on your resume. So instruments, techniques, anything like that you've used. Now, obviously, the more advanced you are, some of those things like titrations you might drop off. So if you're actually doing research in a lab, focus on those skills or those instruments instead. But be very, very specific with your lab skills. Same thing with computer skills. And you might not include them, you might. It kind of depends on the position. If you see in the job description that you have to understand Word, you might want to include that you are familiar with Microsoft Office. Otherwise, you might leave that off. However, if you took that CS course where you learned Python, absolutely you want to include that. Not every employer knows what you're learning in your classes. A few do. They might be alums or recent alums. But even if they graduated a while back, they might not know because they learned a different language when they were here. So if you now have some Python skills, even if they're only this much, that's fine. It's great to include on your resume. Now, some of my students say, I know I learned Python in that class, but I've never used it since. I don't feel comfortable listing it on my resume. That's fine. If you want to qualify, you can do that. So maybe some experience with or knowledge of, and then another thing might be proficient with Microsoft Office. So you can quantify a little bit if you want to. But computer skills would be another good thing. Absolutely. Same thing with foreign languages. If you want to quantify your foreign language experience, but that's something that a lot of employers care about. So maybe you grew up and you spoke a different language in your family. By all means, that needs to be on your resume so that employers know that you've got that ability to learn different skills in different languages. The last thing I would say is if there are other technical skills. You don't want to include the soft skills. So things like, hey, I'm a great leader and I'm a really good team player, and that doesn't really matter because anybody can kind of say that. So instead of listing those things in your skills section, they should be up higher, listed as bullets. So instead of saying, I'm a great team player, say as one of your bullets, collaborated with team of 8. Right there, I'm going to understand, and it's hard to refute experience. So have that under your experience section as bullets as opposed to sticking a bunch of soft, fluffy skills in the skills section. Questions about any of that? Okay, so those are kind of the standard ones. There are other sections that students will sometimes put on their resume, and this really, it depends on you and depends on what you have to sell. So again, I mentioned publications. If you are in a research lab and you have, even if you're 12th author on the list, it's still really, really great as an undergrad to be able to have a publication. So that might even be a separate section you would include. Again, coursework if you wanted to, names, not numbers, activities, leadership experiences you've had. If you've gotten several special awards, again, those would be more college as opposed to high school awards, but those would be other things that you could list. So just shout out. This is pretty much every bad thing I mentioned just a little bit ago is in this resume. So what do you see in here that needs to be fixed, let's say? So I typoed purposely a couple of really common words. I would say the 3 most common mistyped things I see are activites. Microsoft Word always skips activites instead of activities. Illinois, for some reason, I think what happens is if you have like your email address, so you've got that mistyped, because it's not capitalized, it's always going to show up as an error, and so I think people just kind of skip over that. Well, it's just because it's not capitalized. So Illinois gets mistyped a lot. Activites gets mistyped a lot. The other one that I see probably the most is led instead of lead. So if you're saying, you put in there like, I led a team or led a team of 12, whatever, and spelling it L-E-A-D, which is actually lead instead of L-E-D. So if it's past tense, it's L-E-D, even though, yes, PB is also L-E-A-D, but if we're using it on a resume, that would be lead instead of led. Make sense? So L-E-D is the other one. So most of these other things you guys talked about, the consistency, not even just in font type, although that is there too. You can see that's a totally different font type. But even like consistency in underlines and formatting. So if you bold something, that same thing needs to be bold all the way through, or in this case, underlined. Other consistency issues that happen a lot are with your headings. So like this one has a colon, none of the others do. Activites isn't in all caps. You don't really notice it until you really look for it, but you just notice that something's off. And so that's what an employer is going to feel when they look at your resume. They're going to think something's just off here. So kind of jumping through a bunch of these. The other thing is graduation date is missing. So that was also a really big thing. So this one obviously looks a lot better. It looks cleaner. You've got the bullets. You've got focused action verbs. Also, you've got outcomes, the graduation date. So everything is a little bit cleaner. It just is easier to read, and it feels nicer on the eyes. So it really does make a difference when you're looking well, of course, the red doesn't help either, but you're looking at a sort of a messy resume versus something that's clean. I'm just going to be more apt to read it. My brother several years ago was actually in talent acquisition for a company, and he told me once, he's like, if a resume is too complicated for me, or if it puts me to sleep, I don't care how good the content is, I'm not even going to look at it. I'm not even going to consider that person. And I thought at first, I was like, well, that's just not right. But he gets like 200 resumes for every job that he was looking at. So he needed something to start narrowing it down. So sometimes just the initial glance of how it looks is that thing that would do that for him. So make your resume look nice. That'll help you. Won't get you the job, but it'll get you to the next sort of human being looking at it. Another piece of that application is your cover letter. Cover letters are tough to write for anybody. I will absolutely say that. But basically, they've only got 3 portions of that. So you've got your introduction, which is the position you're applying for, if there's a connection that you have with that company, why you're interested in that company or that position. And you can't really just say, because you're the leading chemical company, I'm applying to you. You really want to focus on something that they do or a product that they make, something that would draw you into them. And demonstrate that you're applying intentionally. Now, you might just be applying because they had a position open in Handshake. That's okay. But for them, you need them to believe that you're doing this intentionally. You also want to make sure that the middle section fits back to that job posting. So give me maybe 1 to 2 paragraphs, pick 2 to 3 highlights, and tell me a story about them. So don't just repeat your resume and say, oh, I got this degree and I had this experience. But tell me something about that. Tell me a story as if you were talking to me. And that's that middle section. And then your final is, this is what I want to have happen next. I would love to schedule an interview with you, for example, or discuss my qualifications further. So that's kind of the 3 sections. You want to, again, make sure it's professional, make sure you've proofread it. And then the final one down here in the corner is to whom it may concern. It really is important that you address your letter to a person. Now, it makes it a little bit more difficult. You have to do some research. So you have to dig in and find a name. Now, it might not be the right name, but it's always better to send it to a name. So use LinkedIn, check the company website. If it's not listed in the job description, find a name that might make sense. So say you're applying to a quality assistant position. If there's a director of quality for that company, great person to address your cover letter to. So you want to make sure that it's somebody who makes sense, even if you don't know for sure that they're going to be the one looking at it. It makes it sound a lot more personable than dear to whom it may concern, or even dear hiring manager. The other thing, though, is it really shows that you've gone that extra mile, again, and that you're intentionally applying for that position. So a couple quick things about your cover letter. It generally should look like your resume. So if you're using Arial font on your resume, use Arial font on your cover letter. And basically make it look the same. You want to use block format in a business letter format. So instead of indenting, single space everything, but skip a space in between each paragraph. Just makes it, again, cleaner. It's more standard. Addressing a person, proofreading it, keeping it short and sweet is also important. You have some exceptions if you're applying to graduate school. Sometimes they'll give you a word limit or something along those lines. But for the most part, an actual cover letter is only going to be 3 to 4 paragraphs. So basically short and sweet. And again, you want to personalize it just like you do your resume. Keep that audience in mind and focus everything towards them. So this is, you can't probably read all this, but I just sort of wanted to put this in here. So you can see that in between, they skipped a paragraph. There's no indenting here. So that's the way you really want to make sure that you're writing that letter, except for where the screen pushed me over. So don't indent. You also want to include the same heading. So if this is Nicholas Cooper, his resume would look like this at the top with his name. That's his heading. So have that on the top of your cover letter as well. It makes it look like a nice polished package that goes together. The date, the contact information, and then jump into those 3 paragraphs. I'm going to show you our website again. I know I threw it up there a couple weeks ago, but we have a career resource library of all kinds of handouts on that website. So you can actually go and get examples of cover letters and resumes and a lot of different handouts there. All right, so some general things about what are you going to do, how do you do a job search, and so forth, and I'll kind of throw some of this out there. Number 1 is you really need to figure out what it is that you're looking for, and like I said at the beginning, figure out what your specific strengths are. So go back, what are you interested in? What do you do that you almost lose track of time? It's so fun to you. Is there something with that could be related to your job? Now, maybe the only thing you like to do is watch drama movies. You can still sometimes dig into that. So maybe you like watching dramas because of the suspense and the problem solving and trying to figure out what happens. That you can do in a job. So maybe you don't get to sit around watching dramas all the time, but whatever it is that draws you to that is something that you could incorporate into a job. So think about those interests. Think about the experiences you've had. And I would also encourage you to think about the values that you share. And the values might be something like, I really want to have an impact on my world that I live in, or I really care about sustainability. Those are things that can really help shape your next steps. And a lot of times values are even more maybe basic than that. It's like, hey, I want to have a job where I can balance time with my friends or my family and work. Or maybe it's a certain dollar figure. Hey, I really need a job where I can make $100,000 a year. So whatever it is, I think it's important not just to figure out what those values are, but to rank order them. So yeah, of course, who wouldn't want a job where they're making $100,000 a year, but maybe that's not really your most important value, or maybe it is. And that really should drive the types of positions and what you're really looking for. So think about those values. I mentioned it several times. I'll throw it out there again. Get your account activated with the Handshake at Illinois system. I would also encourage you to create a resume and have that critiqued. Now, if you have a Handshake account and you're a chemistry or chemical engineering major, as soon as you upload it to Handshake, I'm going to look over that and do that critique for you. So that's one way to get around that. Most other majors, you would have to actually run by the Career Center. I would also encourage you to draft an elevator pitch. You probably have heard this in relation to going to a career fair, but you can even use them in other places. So elevator pitch initially comes from standing in an elevator and talking to somebody. And so really it can be used for a lot more than just going to that career fair. It's a good way to introduce yourself to someone new even. Now, that means you have to keep it short. You know, if you're standing there for 3 minutes, they're going to nod off. But making sure that it's focused and sort of tells, here's who I am, here's the type of position I'm looking for, that's a great way to be able to introduce yourself. I've actually even seen it in action, something similar to that, when I was standing at Walmart in line, and these two people just started talking to each other. It didn't really go anywhere at that time in the line at Walmart, but it could have. You know, who knows? So being able to have something prepared like an elevator pitch is a great thing to do early on, even before you're looking at going to career fairs. You also want to make sure that you're preparing some of those stories. So a lot of companies will absolutely ask you about your technical skills and what you learned in your classes, but they're going to ask you behavioral questions. So teamwork and leadership and problem solving. Those things are just as important. Yes, they want to know, can you skill-wise do the job? They also want to know, am I even going to like working with you? Are you even going to be a good fit for our graduate program? So behavioral questions come up quite a bit, and that's where you really want to prepare those stories. Again, most of your career services offices can help you with this. I would encourage you to start networking. If grad school is what you're thinking about, network with people who are students, who are in graduate school, or who are professors. Start that process early. Go to conferences, connect, because you never know which person might help you, or even you be able to help them and make that good connection. And then, again, even if you're looking at grad school and that's the sort of the route you want to go, you might want to know what you're going to do after graduate school. So take advantage of the resources that are here on campus. Go to the career fairs, go to the tech talks, information sessions that happen, and so forth. So that way you can start thinking down the road what might be some potential employers of interest for me later on. If you are looking for an internship or a job now, networking is number one. More positions come as a result of networking than any other thing. Now, I will say the number probably is a little bit lower for current students than it is for experienced professionals, but it's a good habit to kind of get into now, something to start learning about. LinkedIn, all kinds of social media. I actually even had a friend who got a job from Twitter one time because he had posted some really creative comments, and somebody who was following him and said, hey, you should work at so-and-so, and kind of got that connection going. So you never know what sources might lead to positions that might be great resources for you. Conferences, a lot of the undergraduate student organizations will go to national conferences, and they usually have sort of a role or a section for students to play. So get involved in those student activities. I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago, how important that is, but if this is another reason that you have access to potential employers, potential graduate school faculty who may want to work with you, and so forth. So conferences are really great and helpful. Of course, got to put a plug for career services in there. And then any type of professional organization. So a lot of national organizations do have student organizations here on campus. But beyond just getting involved in the student organization, read their publications. So for example, the American Chemical Society puts out chemical and engineering news. And there's different resources, information, articles, whether or not you can keep abreast of what's happening in your industry. That's one good thing. You go to an interview or you have a conversation with a professional, you're up, you know what's going on with your industry. So that's really relevant. There's also job postings and a lot of other types of things in these professional association newsletters and so forth. So that's a great place to go. And then cold calling. Cold calling can be a little scary sometimes, I think. But if there's somebody like, I saw this person on LinkedIn, I have no idea who they are, but this is a dream job for me, reach out to them. Again, come see me, we can talk more about this, but that's a great way to start making some connections early on to see if this is really what you want to do. And then finally, for internships and so forth, temporary agencies or headhunters, as long as they don't charge you, are another resource to look at. These are just a few online things that you can look for. Glassdoor, Simply Hired, chemjobs.net, and then most professional organizations have online resources as well. All right, so I want to talk finally for those of you who do have positions or something lined up for this summer. And I think it's really easy to just go and go through the daily motions of the research lab or the internship or whatever, even the volunteer experience that you're doing. But it's really important that, again, you're intentional, just to keep using that word, but that you make the most of each one of those days. So go beyond just showing up to work and doing the job that you've been assigned. And here's some things that you can keep in mind. So be positive. That even is important. Be willing to say, hey, I want to learn. Now, I mentioned earlier, employers don't care about your ability, your desire to learn early on in the application process. But once you're working for someone, they see that as a good sign. So whether that's an internship in a company or a research position in a lab, if you're demonstrating that you want to continue to grow and you're not just working on the one specific project you've been given, most employers are really going to be excited about that. I would also encourage you to reach out to other areas. So again, if you're working in a research lab, you will have a grad student or a postdoc that you're assigned to. Do the work that they're assigning you to, but it's okay to ask questions of the other grad students that are in that lab or other people that are at your internship. Find out more about other areas. Again, that shows that willingness to learn. And hey, if you are done with your projects, there might be other things that you can pick up. So ask for those additional responsibilities if you have your first role done first. Another thing in particular with internships is you can organize events. We've had students who've organized like softball leagues during their internships, and it's a great way to meet other people. So those would be things probably more outside of work or over lunch. If for some reason you're not doing research or an internship this summer, you can still use your summer by networking and connecting. LinkedIn is a great place to start because you have access to all these alumni that you can reach out to and say, hey, I see you're doing such and such. I'd like to learn more about that. So do that. Volunteering, maybe even an informal job shadow, places where you can go and experience. Always going to be helpful for you, even if you're not getting paid. Something that gives you an opportunity to talk to future interviewers, but also something you can put on your resume. Study abroad and then research or REU. So there's a lot of different things, a lot of ways that you can really take advantage of that summer. So again, I mentioned that I would throw my website up there. If you haven't already written that down, careers.illinois.edu. There's a lot, or careers.scs.illinois.edu. There's a lot of really great handouts in our resource library. If you are a chemistry or chemistry student and you'd like to meet with me, the link to be able to do that is also up there.